Hello, my name is Camille Corbett, and I'm going to be doing a book review on Native Son by Richard Wright. The reason why I did a book review on this book was because I took an African American literature class for my English degree this semester, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. My teacher was Trudy Harris. I attend the University of Alabama, and if you have an opportunity to take African American literature, please make sure that you take it with her because it was absolutely fabulous and I loved it. She kept on talking about this book, and I was like, what is this? I need to read this. I feel like I need to read this. I feel like if I want to be someone that knows about good literature, then I should be reading this book. So I read it. And before I read it, I Googled it a bunch because that's what I do with books because I'm a book nerd. And apparently it's like a huge classic, and I can completely understand why after reading it. This book was lovely. I give it a 5 out of 5, and so you know it's good. I'm giving it a 5 out of 5. The language was perfect. Like, he's able to paint the picture of black oppression, or the way that African Americans were oppressed by white people during this time period, and it's around the turn of the century, I believe. This book is probably one of the leading founding books of contemporary African American literature, and I can see completely why it's beautiful. This book was absolutely lovely. It was able to show like the African American position in the North specifically to white people, and how that they wanted to segregate African Americans and white people in more subtle ways, like in housing and in eating establishments and stuff like that, and also like the underlying prejudice in society. Even though a lot of people view the North as being somewhere better, it was still very racist. There was still a lot of oppression going on, and you were able to see this perfectly because it's set in Chicago. And the protagonist of this novel is Bigger Thomas, and he's a 20-year-old African American male who's had some run-ins with the law previously by trying to steal some tires. And so he went to reform school. However, this novel starts out with him after all of that stuff happens, and he's living with his mother, his sister, his brother, and they're all living together in one room, on a one-room apartment, which is so weird to me, just like a one-room apartment. In fact, when his mother and his sister are changing, he and his brother have to look away. Likewise, when he and his brother are changing, his mother and sister have to look away because it's one room. They could see everything, and they're good. And because of their Christian values and such, they didn't want to be ashamed of looking at their siblings, so they just turned away. And I found that very just interesting, like just the culture, the African American culture of Christianity, and I just love this book. It was able to paint the picture of how African Americans thought and felt in this time period, and like even now, I can say honestly, especially Bigger Thomas. There's always going to be a story of a Bigger Thomas, I think, for African American males until, I don't know, maybe the next 50 years. Hopefully it'll change, but it's been a pretty reoccurring story. And you'll understand why if you read it. And it's lovely. You should just read it because it's a classic, if not anything. And if you want to understand African American culture also, just read it. You'll love it. I loved how Wright was able to paint the language. It was very striking diction. He was able to use imagery so you can better understand the idiosyncrasies of African American culture. This novel starts off with him and his family. He wakes up in his one-room apartment with his mother and his entire family, and his mother was like, "You need to get a job," and stuff. And then you get to see Bigger hang out afterwards. You get to see Bigger hang out with his friends who sort of perpetuate criminality and civil disobedience. They plan to rob this white guy's store, and they masturbate in movie theaters, which is kind of gross. But I mean, if you live in a one-room apartment, where are you going to get the job done? The movie theater. However, I just found it interesting that he just seemed like a normal kid, but with a lot of criminal tendencies, which was sort of weird. Like, he had a gun. He just, like, had a gun on hand, which I found very alarming because he lived in deep poverty, yet he was able to afford a gun, which says something about this sort of community in which they live. And then you see Bigger attempting to get a job for a white family, and he succeeds in getting him a job, and that is where he gets into trouble and where the novel starts hitting off. And I'm not going to ruin it for you and tell you what happens. However, I will tell you that shit gets real. And it's very interesting, and I think you would like it. I'm going to read to you a bit of it, a bit of the book, so you can understand how lovely it is. He had not raised his eyes to the level of Mr. Dalton's face once since he had been in the house. He stood with his knees slightly bent, his lips partly open, his shoulders stooped, and his eyes held a look that went only to the surface of things. There was an organic conviction in him that this was the way white folks wanted him to be in their presence. None had ever told him that in so many words, but their manner had made him feel that they did. He laid the cap down, noticing that Mr. Dalton was watching him closely. Maybe he was not acting right. Goddamn clumsy. He searched for the paper. He could not find it at first, but he felt and called upon to say something for taking so long. I had it right here in my vest pocket, he mumbled. Take your time. Oh, here it is. He drew the paper forth. It was crumpled and soiled. Nervously he straightened it out and handed it to Mr. Dalton, holding it by its very tip. All right now. Let's see what you've got here. You live in 3721 Indiana Avenue? Yes, sir. Mr. Dalton paused, frowned, and looked up at the ceiling. What kind of building is that over there? You mean where I live, sir? Yes. Oh, it's just an old building. Where do you pay rent? Down 31st Street. To the Southside Real Estate Company? Yes, sir. Bigger wondered what all these questions could mean. He had heard that Mr. Dalton owned the Southside Real Estate Company, but he was not sure. How much rent do you pay? $8 a week. For how many rooms? We just got one, sir. I see. Now, Bigger, tell me, how old are you? I'm 20. Married? No, sir. Sit down. You needn't stand. That won't be long. Yes, sir. Okay, so, as you can see, it's very interesting, very racial, but it's also lovely. It's a great classic, and even if you don't really care much for race relations, still read it. It's great language, as you can see. It's great writing. It also definitely helps you get into the mind of your fellow Americans, which is lovely. I just love stuff like that. I just love this book, and you should definitely check it out. It's a 5 out of 5, and if you don't read it, I'm going to be very sorry for you. And if you do, good job. The next book I shall be reading is The Known World by Edward P. Jones, so be looking for that. See you later.